Okay, welcome. This is one of the lectures that's a little bit off from diseases, but actually, if you look at environmental microbiology as we move forward, you're going to find that it has a very important place in public health and in prevention of many different diseases. So let's move on. Okay. Now, if you look here, you see all pristine waters and snow-capped mountains and all of that wonderful forests and beautiful landscape. How do we basically keep it that way? Well, there are a variety of tools that are out there. And we're going to talk about this because when you use water in so many different ways. But you have to, what you use to wash away things, you've got to find some way to recapture that water. And that's what we're going to talk about today, as well as how do we handle the waste and materials that we have used to wash away using the water. So the question comes up, what is environmental microbiology? Well, one area that we examine very carefully is the control of wastewater, because really it's critical to prevent waterborne diseases, bacterial, viral, etc., parasites. When we talk about wastewater, it's also used as a term for sewage. Now, this is composed of water from bathing and washing, as well as toilet waste. And a lot of industrial sites also use water, but they also have in municipal wastewater business industrial waste and, of course, stormwater runoff. And if you look at it, we have developed a nice system where we handle a lot of cases storm runoff to the point where we prevent certain things from going in there. You'll see signs in different places where there might be a storm runoff site, and they'll say, please don't dump oil. In other words, yes, use car oil in there. Some people used to do that. And it would contaminate the storm runoff. It would make it much more difficult to process that water, or worse. Now, one problem with wastewater, you have a high nutrient content. And if you just let that flow out, it can be damaging to the receiving water. So, in other words, think of it this way. You have every once in a while a health warning if, let's say, a septic or a sewage system has been taking care of municipal sewage, municipal water, etc., and it kind of spills out. And so you have raw sewage going into water such as rivers, lakes, oceans. That can be detrimental because it can just be a shock. What happens is this raw material will result in the depletion of biological oxygen in the water, because suddenly you've got all this massive bloom of bacteria, etc. It may also kill other native organisms, fish, aquatic animals, etc. We're going to get a little bit more into this, but how do we prevent this? That's the biggie. So we're going to look at that. Now, I talked about biological oxygen. And really what I'm talking about is what is called BOD, biological oxygen demand. This is the amount of oxygen required for the microbial decomposition of organic matter. Now, you think about this, and you end up having a large amount of sewage, such as, household wastes and things like that. You add sort of a nutrient media to the new water, and this causes this bloom. It can be a bloom of algae if you've had too much phosphates. It can be a bloom of bacteria if it's just a matter of fecal matter going into the water, etc. This causes a depletion in the water. So if you see here the numbers, natural water, the dissolved O2, dissolved oxygen, is about 5 to 10 milligrams per liter. The BOD of raw sewage is 300 to 400 milligrams per liter. This can basically completely deplete the oxygen in the natural water. And when that happens, of course, you have a lot of organisms that those that can get out of the area migrate downstream, upstream, whatever. But those that cannot die. Now, there has been the development of large-scale wastewater treatment plants. They basically use a two-step process as required by the 1972 Federal Water Pollution Control Act. It's been updated and upgraded, and now they just refer to it as the Clean Water Act. When you treat sewage, wastewater, you end up with two basic components, the effluent, which is more the liquid portion, and the sludge, which is more the solid portion. And we're going to get into some of the characteristics of both in a bit. Now, there's one other problem, industrial waste. Now, industrial waste can be anything from organic solvents, heavy metals. You could be talking about a garage that's fixing brakes and changing oil and stuff. Or you could be talking about a manufacturing site that's plating metal or makes engines or airplane parts, or just a very, very large food production factory. So usually what happens is at the industrial site, there is a standard water treatment facility that is set up at the industrial site. So they take care of their water and remove a large amount of the contaminants before they release the water into the standard wastewater treatment facilities, into the municipal ones. Now, let's get into the steps of wastewater treatment. First, you have primary treatment. This is a physical process that removes materials that can be filtered out or will settle out. You usually have a lot of screens because screens have to be there to remove sticks, rags, trash, things like that. Skimmers will remove scum, and usually this is scum is sort of a floating oils and greases. You know, oil doesn't mix well with water, so it's going to kind of come to the top of wherever the water layer is. There's also going to be initially sedimentation tanks, and they're going to allow more solids to settle out. The primary treatment will remove approximately 50% of the solids and 25% of the BOD raw wastewater. Now, if you go to the next level, which we'll get into in a minute, you'll find that we can remove even more of the BOD material. You see, once the primary step is completed, the bottom of the tank is going to be scraped. Basically, you remove the primary sludge. This is sent to a secondary anaerobic sludge digester. Keep in mind, aerobic is with oxygen. Anaerobic, AN, says without it. So we have different microorganisms that play a role in this. Now, in the secondary treatment, you have the biological processes that convert the suspended solids into inorganic compounds and a cell mass. What happens is that as much as you want those particles to kind of settle down to the bottom, some of them are going to be almost like colloids. They're going to be present in the liquid no matter what. So you're going to basically go through a second level of processing. This will eliminate 95% of the BOD. Now, aerobic organisms are going to basically convert a lot of the biologically degradable organic material to carbon dioxide and water. So it's basically providing them with the necessary nutrients so that the bacteria will remove a lot of material of that organic floating material that's still in this suspended, and it will basically use it as fuel and at the same time convert it to CO2 and water. What you see here, oops, sorry about that. What you see here is a process. First you have the screens, then you have this primary treatment. Now, the sludge from the primary treatment is going to be sent over to an anaerobic digester. We'll get more into that in a minute. Here's the different levels or different options to use a secondary treatment. First, we have this liquid waste. Now, the liquid waste still is going to have some floating material. You got to keep that in mind. So we're going to let the microbes do the work here. We may pump air into it, and it's going to be an aeration tank. And then we have further sedimentation. And then we basically go through the sludge digestion. We may use instead a trickling filter system. That's where basically you might see some of these round tanks, and they've got sort of like a sprinkler system around it. And it may be having some rocks or pebbles or something else. Don't be dismayed about the rocks and pebbles. It's the biofilm that's on the rocks and pebbles that are going to basically break down and clean up to a degree the water, and at the same time remove some of the floating material. And what it is that basically the rocks provide for a firm foundation for a biofilm. Now, another option is, of course, just pump the liquid into these large lagoons. They're kind of like shallow ponds. And what they're going to do is basically have microorganisms that will break it down, sunlight, and other things. In some cases where you don't have these nearby ponds, you make them. And this is where we get into constructed wetlands. It is very interesting because they found that as you add on wetlands, so that you take the final amount of fluid and send it out, it seems to reduce most of the BOD, and it becomes a habitat for favorable organisms, birds, wildlife, etc. Now, we're going to mention this in a minute, aerobic sludge digester. Here, I don't need oxygen. I've got anaerobic microbes that are going to break down some of this material, and then any of the remaining solids, well, those are going to be basically dried out, and they will be either incinerated, but that's not too favorable now, or they're used as a soil enhancer. The city of Milwaukee has a product called Milorganite, and yes, it is the solids from the Milwaukee municipal system, and they do quite well. A lot of people use Milorganite for lawns as lawn fertilizer. We're going to get into also the advanced treatment here, because one of the problems you have is sometimes the liquid that comes off still has a lot of ammonia, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We don't want lots and lots and lots of phosphorus to go into the water, because that'll cause what they call biological blooms. You may have seen where they have red tide. Sometimes red tide gets triggered by runoff from fertilizer from farms. But in municipal areas or in city areas, it was very common in the 1960s to see rivers with lots of foam, and this was soapy foam. They were dumping their wastewater directly into the rivers. And so there was a sense that you could have all sorts of strange chemicals in there. Sometimes the river would actually go up on fire. And there was jokes about it going on. And eventually what they started to do was actually clean this up under the Clean Water Act. And a lot of this, the waste and everything else, went away. Finally, we have to have some destruction, because maybe we'll still have to have some pathogens or other microbes. So water, in some cases, will be treated again with chlorination, ozone, or ultraviolet light. Now, if you add chlorine, one of the problems you've got is you've got to dechlorinate before you move forward. So let's go on. And as you can see here in my notes, we have the activated sludge process, and that's using mixed populations of aerobic bacteria. And they grow as flocks, in other words, suspended biofilms, lumps, you could kind of say that, moving around. And they add O2. That's where you get this aerator. And it basically is added to the mix. It creates biomass and waste products of CO2. One of the other formats is a trickling filter system, frequently used in smaller systems. As I mentioned before, that's a rotating arm. It distributes the wastewater over the biofilm of mixed organisms which aerobically degrade the organic matter. One of the other places you'll see is also the lagoons. You take the wastewater and you channel it to these man-made shallow ponds or lagoons, and they're degraded aerobically by algae and cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, if you're never familiar with it, those are another type of bacteria that actually use sunlight, and they will produce oxygen. Okay, so here is the rotating arm process. Basically, water comes up, the liquid waste, from the primary treatment center comes up here, and then you have this rotating arm that basically sprays down all the pebbles. They may be plastic pieces or coarse gravel and rocks. These are covered with a biofilm of microorganisms, and it will break down things as the water trickles through. And then you eventually have a liquid waste from the filter goes to a sedimentation tank. So this is an outlet pipe, and it may require still further advanced treatment or disinfection. Finally, of course, I mentioned the constructed wetlands. Again, it's a similar approach to the lagoon, but you know what? They found that by doing this, they get such a biodiversity of life that it becomes a suitable wetland for birds and other wildlife. As you can see here. Now, they may have artificially started it, but now you see how this water is literally getting cleaned up, not merely by the microorganisms, but by the presence of both a variety of other organisms, plants, algae, etc. And it really does work wonders. The only problem as a challenge is that it takes a lot of land in some cases. And so what happens is you have X amount of land for your treatment plant, but then you're going to have a Y amount of land to set up this wetland right next to it. Now, when I talked about advanced treatments, a lot of times these are going to involve a variety of physical, chemical, or biological processes. The big emphasis is on the removal of excess phosphate, nitrates, and ammonia. What happens is that some bacteria will be able to take the ammonia and turn it into nitrogen. Just nitrogen gas. Yay, that's good. Some will incorporate the phosphate, and some will take the nitrates and convert it into nitrites, etc. Now, the idea is that you don't want too much of a nutrient-rich media to get into either wastewater, into your wetlands, or going off into the river, because it's going to create unusual blooms, algae blooms. It becomes very hostile of an environment for certain organisms. Now, if you suspect, and it's possible, that there is still some pathogens around, prior to discharge into the receiving water, you may add a step for disinfection, and that usually includes chlorine, ultraviolet light, or ozone. Now, because chlorine can be so devastating, and you don't want it to build up, Usually what they do is they chlorinate it so it kills the organisms, then adds a dechlorination step and removes a lot of the chlorine. Okay? Now, what do we do with the sludge? It is very interesting today because if you go back to about the 60s, people would have raised their noses, etc. But now, the sludge is removed from both primary and secondary steps. It's transferred to an anaerobic digester. Now, this anaerobic digestion will produce methane gas. Now, the methane gas can be basically harvested for biogas. And in 2/3 of the world, they actually do this. Yep, in some cases, it's part of their home. Provides the gas necessary for heating, for lighting, etc. Some other places will unfortunately just allow it to be released. But after you've done that, the biosolids, and these are considered now stabilized solids, so they're called that also. They can be used as a fertilizer for lawns, farms, etc. There used to be certain farmers that began the process, and it doesn't smell too much, but they plow it right in, and it enhances their soil fertility, and they get bigger yields in the crops. There's no diseases that are believed to be associated with this. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Milwaukee, which has done this using milorganite as a drying the solids, packaging them in big, 50-pound bags or something like that, and people use it as fertilizer for their lawns, etc. Now, what about rural homes? We've been talking about basically wastewater treatment systems that are more where you have a higher population density, either city or suburb, etc. Okay? So, in rural homes, they rely on septic systems for wastewater. Wastewater solids settle into a large tank, and they are anaerobically digested. The solids are removed periodically. Being that I used to live in Western Massachusetts, you have a septic system. What happens is you call a gentleman, and they come up, and they basically remove the cement cap. Usually the cap is covered with about 6 inches of soil. And they just pump it all out, and they bring it over to the local sewage treatment plant. And you do that every couple of years, and everything is great. In Massachusetts, the process, the laws regarding it are called Title V. And you can't sell a house without a Title V inspection, and the inspection writes off and says, yep, the system is still working, fine, no problem. Now, that's because we don't want some of the wastewater basically migrating into what could be groundwater or other systems. So we've talked about the large tank. Well, what about the effluent? So the effluent goes down, percolates into a set of pipes that are perforated, meaning they've got holes along them. And the pipes are surrounded by a gravel filled draining field. Okay? And the only problem that you have to do is you have to watch out. If you put high amount of bleach or antibacterial soaps, they can inhibit microbial activity. A minor little story. There was a time I worked at one institution, and this is for students, and the students were in emotional disturbed or crisis. So they had to be responsible for their own cleaning of their laundry. Well, the young ladies used so much chlorine, I mean, just pouring it full blast, no measuring cup, no nothing, that eventually they killed the entire septic system. And a septic system had to be rebuilt, which cost $20,000, $30,000. and the head of the program was not happy with this. But let's move aside. Any pathogens in the wastewater can exist in that effluent. So you have that potential. Therefore, where you have the drainage, you never allow it to drain or contaminate local water supplies. So you have an engineer set up where the septic drainage system is, but it's not near any wetlands, nature wetlands, or near any groundwater like pumps, people that have wells and things like that. Because you don't want to have that happening where it can then possibly contaminate or make someone very, very ill. And as you can see here, here's an example of this. You have the household wastewater coming in there. Now, some places I've seen, I actually have seen this in Florida, is they have two separate septic tanks. One handles what they call the gray water, meaning, the brown water, meaning that it contains just, human fecal matter, waste like that. Then they have another one that handles the gray water, which is more like laundry and other things. But the key point is that the septic tank will grab onto the solids, hold on to it here, have maybe some scum here. This is the wastewater coming in. And then the liquid drains out to another field. In the meantime, all of the solids, or a lot of them, get passed down and descend into here's sludge. Basically, you have also, this is usually a much larger box. Some of them nowadays require 1,200 to 1,275 gallons. So you got a big, deep box. And the drainage goes out to this field. This is all wrapped with gravel around it. And basically what you have in some cases is a vent pipe. And you can tell the vent pipes, if you ever see them, kind of strange. They look like a candy cane, but it's made of PVC pipe, and it's not red. It's just a white pipe that comes out of the ground, and it's just a drain pipe and allows for any methane or something that just gets vented out. All right? Okay. Now, we're going to move into drinking water treatment and testing. Large cities can obtain drinking water from lakes, rivers, etc. The problem is that in some cases, water treatment has not always been very good. Flint, Michigan is one sad disaster where it turned out that there was a lot of contaminants, particularly lead, that was in the water. And what had happened was the drinking water processing plant had shut down, and they went straight to regular river water, and a lot of people got sick. Now, usually what we have is we have to deal with any type of natural source, whether it's reservoir, whether it's river or lakes. We got to be aware of that contamination can occur. Usually it's from animal feces or industrial effluent or fertilizer runoff. Some communities or individual homes access groundwater for drinking. So in other words, groundwater, they have a well. But the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1976, now this was later amended in 86 and in 96, basically sets limits on drinking water contaminants. It empowers the Environmental Protection Agency to see and monitor these situations. And it also basically sets maximum levels for viruses, giardiasis, and cryptosporidium oocysts. Okay? And you can see this here, as I mentioned to you. You're going to have rainfall, you're going to have sludge, etc. You don't want that too close to a drinking water well, a sewer line that breaks, fertilizer that's used excessively, plus irrigation, which will wash the fertilizer into the soil, but it may go further. You have a septic tank, and sometimes if you have a defective well lining, usually what happens with drinking water is you have to find out how deep is the basic groundwater levels. In some parts of the country, the big challenge is that they have been feeding off of these aquifers for so long, and they have not been getting sufficient replenishment by rainfall, etc. So what happens is down the road is they end up with dry wells. But here we're talking about contamination. And that's what we're going to deal with. What do you do with the solid waste afterwards if you have to just dispose of them? Okay. All right. Now, community drinking water provides safe water. We usually use the term potable water. If you've ever seen that on vehicles or trucks, and they're carrying potable water that's basically safe to drink. And they transport from a reservoir to an initial settling tank. Now, I can tell you from where we lived, we had one of the largest reservoirs in New England, not too far away from us. And there were also smaller reservoirs in different parts of Western Mass. And they monitored things. If there was any chance that something could get in there, or if there was heavy rains and there was lots of animals that had been doing pooping, they would get some of these microorganisms into the water. But we'll get into some of the testing later. When the water comes into initial settling tank, they will add some type of coagulation material. Now, this material may be alum or other types of things, but it forms clumps. These are referred to as flock, and these will then settle out. And then they may continue further steps to include sedimentation and filtering. But because this is going to be consumed, this is going to be drinking water, they may include final steps including disinfection as well as storage. For example, disinfection may include the use of chlorine, ultraviolet light, or ozone. And in some cases, they've used more than just one. So in other words, they'll use ozone with ultraviolet light or chlorine with ultraviolet light, etc. And one of the problems you have with chlorine anytime is if you have enough organic matter still in there, the chlorine loses its effectiveness. You have to add greater amounts. Now here we have the situation of large matter material settling in. This is for a water system for a municipality. You add the coagulant here, so it could be alum or other types of chemicals, and so you have this flock form. These are like floating particles that get bigger and bigger and eventually settle out. Then you have the sedimentation tank, and then the water is sent through. And in this place here, the filtration, that's where you're going to have microorganisms, protozoal cysts, oocysts, etc. And that's the filtration. You may finally add activated charcoal filters to remove any dissolved chemicals as well. The surface area of activated charcoal is incredible, and it's useful in decontamination or breaking down of certain chemicals. Finally, when we've had our reservoir, we've stored our water, before we have it for consumer use, usually you treat it with either UV radiation, chlorine, ozone, or a combination. Now, all of this sounds very academic until you start realizing how important this is. If you look on the y-axis, number of typhoid cases per 100,000. Now, typhoid can be from contamination. Okay, and the contamination, you have a certain bacteria that can be passed through the fecal system. And if you see here from 1890, I mean, there were some serious spikes where, 600 people per 100,000 were getting sick. And in the early 1990s, then they began filtration. And you notice that the level dropped down, but then they added chlorination. And that really knocked everything down. And as it's continued, you basically have very clean potable water that has been useful to this day. Now, how are we sure that the process does what it's supposed to do? Well, there's drinking water testing. And this is absolutely critical if you want to determine if the water is contaminated with intestinal pathogens or not. Now, the problem is you might have to use some indicator organisms as if to say, look, I'm not testing for 15 different or 60 different types of organisms. I'm going to sit there and say the most common organisms that might be around will probably tell us that there is some possible pathogens present. That's the major concept. We use surrogate organisms that would be normally found in feces. You might have heard when they do these coliform tests, people can't go into ponds or swim lakes because they say the coliform numbers are too high. That's because in that water there may be bacteria that came from fecal deposits from, you name it, birds, nearby cow, etc. So the total coliforms, this is the most common form of testing. What you do is you're really testing for lactose fermenting Enterobacteriaceae, and then of course it includes E. coli. Okay, so now there are other types of water testing. You can do the presence versus absence test, which is basically a water sample. You add it to lactose broth, and you add a Durham tube. The Durham tube is going to trap gas because what we're saying is if this organism ferments lactose, it's going to create either CO2 or something else, and that can be detected by the Durham tube. Remember we had those very thin little tubes? And if they're floating and they've got a little bubble in there, you know that you've got contamination. Now, another method is called the most probable number method. And what this is it's a combination of both a series of dilutions and a statistical analysis. And basically what you do is you determine if you keep diluting and diluting and diluting in a set number. So I take 1/10 from the first sample, put it into a 9/10 broth, and then take 1 from there, and I continue on. So I'm getting dilution down to 1 to 10, 1 to 100, 1 to 1,000, et cetera, et cetera. And I still get bacteria. That's telling me probably that I had serious bacteria in the original sample. Now, there's another way to do it. And there are membrane filtration systems. Basically, you take a membrane, could be paper, could be a type of plastic. It's got little holes in it, but the holes are not big enough to allow bacteria to go through it. You put the water sample through the filter. It's going to trap the bacteria. Then you take that filter and you put it into a selective agar. It's a differential selective agar, but it also contains lactose. If you get any growth, you get any culture, yep, you got contamination of bacteria. And you can see this is one of the tests that they had. If you go back here, we had the a type of test that basically looked at a chemical test where you had the opung and the mung. In those tests, you could determine if the presence based on E. coli and based on some of these other organisms were present. Okay, so we've been talking about effluent and pure water and things like that. So what do we talk about here with solid waste treatment? Now, I'm not going to get into the massive amount of, like trash, like tossed away beer cans and old furniture and all that stuff. Let's just talk about some of the non-hazardous biosolid wastes, okay? So when I say that we have a sanitary landfill, this is a site that's used to dispose non-hazardous solid waste. But there's criteria for placing some of these landfills. They have to be away from an earthquake site. They have to be away from wetlands. They have to be away from floodplains, etc. Now, usually what you do is you have the site with a clay bottom, as well as you're going to put a clay cap on top. But before you put the bottom and start putting material in, you add like plastic sheeting. Now, this is to prevent seepage of the contaminants. Once you've got that cap of sand also on top of that that's placed, you are also going to have, again, those little tubes that are going to stick out, and that's going to be allowing methane, which would be normally produced by the microbiology that's present still in the solids, and you're going to basically either do one of two things: collect that methane that's being generated or vent it out. There was actually some years ago a community out in California. They had such a large landfill. And what they did was they literally tapped into the methane production there, and it ran the town's electricity for quite some time. I don't know if it's still there right now. There is a problem. Now, landfills have their limits. Some states have already exhausted their landfill sites. So in an area such as where I resided, we had our landfill that all sorts of stuff was just dumped there, and then they capped it with soil, etc. And there are some communities in Chicopee, Massachusetts, or in Hartford, Connecticut, where they're taking in the waste from a bunch of different nearby communities, because those communities, their landfills are filled. And it's only a matter of time before they get to the point where they have no more place to put the stuff. Okay? And that's one of the challenges that exists right now. Now, there is something to be said for some other alternative means. If we're not talking about industrial waste, if we're talking about, solid waste like plant matter, garbage, let's say you had a plant that was processing lobster and crab. So they have a lot of those, lots of the shells, etc. Or they're processing fruit, and so they have the fruit rinds and everything else. There are some ways to compost that material. Let decomposition from the microbes, both fungi and bacteria, to break it down and then use it for some other purpose. So composting is a process to convert solid waste, and you are using a controlled decomposition via microbes into solid to improve the soil fertility and soil structure. Because what happens is, as long as this is clean compost, meaning that it doesn't have industrial material or pathogens, and a lot of places now do this. Some communities, they have a composting site near the physical or what do they call it? Community physical plant, whatever. And they'll take the Christmas trees, grind those up. They'll take all the leaves, grind those up. And basically, they'll have these huge mountains of compost. And basically, the only thing you really need is oxygen. So you take the oxygen. For somebody who's doing it for themselves, they just have to aerate it. That may mean they have to go and turn over the pile. In other cases, they have to keep the area moist for microbial growth. And, aeration with large municipal composting, you basically use heavy equipment, bucket loaders, things like that. Here's the trick, though. During the microbial activity, you get a temperature of 55 to 65 degrees Celsius. Now, look, that's warm. You're talking somewhere between 140 and about 160. First off, that destroys pathogens. Second, you have thermophilic bacteria, and they're going to help continue to generate heat. They're going to continue the decomposition. What you have left is basically a solid breakdown matter, and you can basically use that for fertilizer. You can use it to build up soils, etc. Here's a young man here putting his into a composter structure. The idea is the composting occurs in layers, and then at the bottom, you pull out the lowest level, and there you have compost. And it can be, corn cobs and cantaloupe rinds and all sorts of other stuff. The big thing is that there's nothing in there pathogenic per se. Okay, now here, and you notice that steam, we're going to get to it in a second. This is a bucket loader, and it's doing a turning over to make sure that the compost piles get aerated. Now, what's this? This steam, it's not fog, folks. It's actually heat and steam coming off from the warmed up compost piles. And it's amazing that after so many days when the bacteria get really going and everything else, that you can sink a shovel or sink a bucket loader into it, and you will get this tremendous amount of heat because of the microbial activity breaking down all of this. And like I said, some communities, what they do is they collect all the Christmas trees after Christmas. They collect all the leaves and anything else that, fallen branches and stuff like that. They basically grind it all up and they throw it together. And with a short period of time, you've got yourself a large amount of compost that can be used for farms, gardens, enhancement of soil, etc. Finally, we come down to an area called bioremediation. Now, in this microbiology of my bioremediation, you have to understand something. What are we trying to do? Okay. It is a process of using microorganisms to degrade or detoxify pollutants in a given environment. Now, when I'm talking pollutants, I'm not talking about the wrapper from Burger King. I'm talking about DDT. I'm talking about jet fuel that's been spilled, oil. I'm talking about toxic chemicals. This process can help reduce bioaccumulation of pollutants in the environment. Bioaccumulation would be basically the process that you see where every time you go up into a higher member of the food chain, they have more of this pollutants accumulated in their tissues. Okay, we'll get a little bit more into that in a minute. Now, we have found that there have been microorganisms that break down complex pollutants. A lot of times it's because they have very unique or selective enzymes. Also, they will break down xenobiotics. Now, look, xenobiotics are synthetic compounds, very different from anything we see in nature. In other words, they're man-made. that probably never existed on this planet beforehand. DDT, the herbicides 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. So you sit there and you say, wait a minute, there's bacteria that can break down, like organophosphates and some really other nasty stuff. Yeah, we found them. And now what we do is we try to cultivate them or help them along so they can do the bioremediation. There's two strategies. One is biostimulation, the other is bioaugmentation. Now here is the bioaccumulation I was talking about a minute ago. Look at this. This is the magnification or bioaccumulation of DDT. If you look, very small amount in parts per million of DDT in the water. But plankton living in the water concentrated it. The minnows that consume the plankton, they end up concentrating it. The heron, that eats all these minnows, builds up a certain amount in their tissue. And then the merganser, it's a fish-eating duck, guess what? It ends up accumulating even more. Now, some of the accumulation, I want you to understand, depending on the different compounds, will build up in fatty tissue. That means not just adipose tissue, but it means, for example, in the brain tissue, etc. Some of them cause all sorts of reproductive failures also, So as you go up on each level of the food chain, you see this tissue concentration occurring. Here is a comparison of the rates of degradation of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. These are basically herbicides, And what happens is over a period of days, the 2,4-D within 10 days is now about 12.5%. So we're looking about its half-life being somewhere around the range of about, maybe 3-4 days. And then again, the next half-life is about in the 6-day area. This one's a little tougher. And that's because it has that added chlorine right there. As a result, you have to find more unique organisms that are able to break down this, as well as you can find ways to help cultivate those organisms that can break down this. So let's get back to the two strategies of bioremediation. Biostimulation. Now that's the process to increase the effectiveness of oil degradation by naturally occurring organisms. The book focuses on oil degradation. There's a lot of other things that you can do. You might have remembered the disaster where they had an oil spill due to a blowout of basically an oil rig out in the Gulf. Well, what they did was they had started to spray nitrates and phosphates in a solution to enhance bacterial degradation of that oil spill. There are various microbes that can naturally on their own break down oil. And if you give them the right conditions of growth and sustainment, they will be able to reproduce and break down even more of the oil. Now, bioaugmentation is a little bit different. Similar, but a little bit different. It's a process that involves the addition of other microbes in the contaminated areas. So you can add on some other bacteria that can help break down some of the components that the original bacteria that were there started. You can also include fungi, These will help accelerate the degradation process. Now, let me just go back for you for a couple of examples. When the Iron Curtain fell, and a lot of these nations that were formerly under Soviet control, they went to various governments in the West, like the UK and the United States, and said, we've got airfields that are completely contaminated. They're contaminated with explosives. They're contaminated with jet fuel and greases and all that. Can your people come out and help us? And they did. And what they did was, in some cases, they used either biostimulation or bioaugmentation. They looked around for organisms that could break down jet fuel that was now soaked into the soil, or hexane or other types of chemicals. Some of them were actually explosives that were kind of leaked out, and they helped break down some of these materials. You have, for example, trichloroethene and its breakdown, but there's a whole host of other chemicals that bioremediation has been now taking on an active case. In other words, what I mean by that is it's gone from the laboratory now into the manufacturing and into the business world to clean up sites that were considered hazardous. And it's not just hazardous in the sense of, something unusual of a chemical. For example, you probably have noticed where some stations, gas stations, have to have their storage tanks, which are underground. They have to have them taken out every 5 years. Now, in my state, Massachusetts, they did this religiously. The reason? Because beforehand, the way that they would take out the tanks was only when they were leaking, which meant that the soil was contaminated with gasoline or diesel fuel or both. Now, how do you deal with the contaminated soil? Well, one of the ways they do it is they find organisms that can be sprayed onto that soil and that will eventually break down some of these petrochemicals. Okay. Now here you see is two gentlemen. They've come onto an area that's contaminated with oil spill, and they are spraying the phosphate and the nitrates necessary to accelerate the breakdown of this oil contamination. And considering that you're talking about acres, in some cases hundreds of acres of land that's contaminated, or seashore, etc., that's quite an amazing feat in and of itself. Okay, so that's about where we're going to stand right now. I encourage you to stay on top of everything, your readings, your lectures, and your labs, and we will meet again soon. Have a wonderful day.